It is 6 p.m. here in Cairo, time for the news bulletin, and we will be starting straight away with the main headlines. Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati intensifies the foreign contacts to diffuse the regional tensions. Gaza Civil Defense Agency says that the Israeli occupation strikes killed 14. And Syria tribes clash with the Druze fighters near Suwaida. Minister of Foreign Migration and the Egyptian Expatriates Affairs, Badr Abdulati, continued the foreign contacts to de-escalate the tensions in the region. The Foreign Minister conducted phone calls with the British Foreign Minister David Lammy, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and the Chief of the International Nuclear Agency, Rafael Grossi. The talks focused on the stepped-up efforts to cement an Iranian-Israeli ceasefire, which grants the non-renewal of the hostile acts and the advancement of the peaceful solutions. The phone calls also tackled the means of reviving negotiations on the Iranian nuclear program, especially with the imminent deadline of the activation of the UN sanctions as announced by the E3, France, Britain, and Germany. Gaza Civil Defense Agency said that the Israeli occupation strikes killed 14 people in the north and the south of the Palestinian territory. The emergency service said that the fighter jets conducted airstrikes and there was artillery shelling and gunfire in the early morning in areas north of the city of Khan Yunis. Agency officials said that 10 people were killed in 2 separate strikes in the Khan Yunis area, with one hitting a house and the other tents sheltering displaced people. Armed tribes clashed with the Druze fighters outside Suwaida a day after the government troops withdrew from the city. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported clashes west of Suwaida, pitting the tribal fighters and the Bedouin on one side against the Druze fighters on the other. Combatants on both sides confirmed the clashes and reported hearing exchanges of fire. Israel has agreed to allow the limited access by the Syrian forces into the Suwaida area of Syria for the next 2 days, after days of bloodshed in and around Syria's Druze city of Suwaida. Damascus had this week deployed troops to Suwaida, which is adjacent to the territory controlled by Israel, to try to quell some of the most intense internal fighting in Syria since the interim government took power late last year. The head of the United Nations Human Rights Office urged the Syrian interim authorities to ensure accountability, justice for what it said are credible reports of the widespread rights violations during the fighting. The Lebanese Health Ministry reported that 4 people were killed in separate Israeli occupation strikes on the South Lebanon, as Israel said it had targeted 2 Hezbollah members. The attacks are the latest despite the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. The ministry said that an Israeli drone strike targeted a car in the Mabtiya district, killing 1 person and wounding 2 others. Another strike targeted a truck in the town of Naqoura in southern Lebanon, resulting in 1 martyr. The Israeli occupation military said in a statement that it had killed a naval commander in Hezbollah's Radwan force in the area of Kufur, South Lebanon. For his part, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told the European counterparts that they have no grounds for reactivating the UN sanctions after they threatened to do so in the coming months unless there is progress in the nuclear talks. He said that any new round of talks is only possible when the other side is ready for a fair, balanced, and mutually beneficial nuclear deal. The remarks came after Araghchi held a conference call with the British, French, and German counterparts and the European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas. The European diplomats told Araghchi of the determination to use the snapback mechanism, which allows for the reimposition of all the international sanctions against Iran in the absence of the concrete progress towards a new deal on Iran's nuclear program by the end of the summer. France, Britain and Germany told Iran that they would restore the UN sanctions unless it reopened the talks on its nuclear program immediately and produced concrete results by the end of August. The foreign ministers of the so-called E3, along with the European Union's foreign policy chief, held the first call with the Iranian foreign minister Abbas Araghchi since Israel and the United States attacked Iranian nuclear facilities a month ago. A French diplomatic source said that the ministers had urged Iran to resume diplomacy immediately to reach a lasting deal, threatening to use the snapback mechanism if it failed to do so. The three European countries, along with China and Russia, are the remaining parties to the 2015 deal that lifted sanctions on Iran in return for the restrictions on its nuclear program. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that peace negotiations with Russia needed more momentum and that he had asked new National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustam Umerev to intensify the negotiation track. For its part, the Kremlin also said that it agreed with a statement by Zelensky that there needed to be more momentum around peace talks between the warring sides. 2 rounds of talks between Ukraine and Russia in Turkey earlier this year have yielded little more than an agreement to exchange the prisoners and soldiers' remains. The European Union reached an agreement on an 18th sanctions package against Russia over its war in Ukraine with a raft of measures aimed at dealing further blows to the Russian oil and energy industry. The details follow. European Union countries on Friday signed off on a new package of sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine, including lowering a price cap on Moscow's oil exports. The 18th round of the economic punishment against Russia since the 2022 military operation was approved after Slovakia dropped a weeks-long block following talks with Brussels over separate plans to phase out the Russian gas imports. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said that the European Union just approved one of the strongest sanctions packages against Russia to date. As part of the new sanctions designed to sap Russia's war chest, diplomats said that the EU has agreed to lower the price cap on the Russian oil exported to the third countries around the world to 15% below the market value. That comes despite the EU allies failing to convince the US President Donald Trump to go along with the plan. The cap is a G7 initiative aimed at limiting the amount of money Russia makes by exporting oil to countries across the globe, such as China and India. In addition, officials said the EU is blacklisting over 100 more vessels in the shadow fleet of aging tankers used by Russia to circumvent the oil export curbs. Among other targets, sanctions will be placed on the Russian-owned oil refinery in India and 2 Chinese banks as the European Union seeks to curb Moscow's ties with the international partners. There is also an expanded transaction ban on the dealings with the Russian banks and more restrictions on the export of the dual-use goods that could be used on the battlefield in Ukraine. The new sanctions will be formally adopted by the EU ministers later on Friday. Russia's defense ministry said that the air defenses destroyed 73 Ukrainian drones overnight, including 3 heading for Moscow. Most of the drones were downed over the Russian southwestern regions, including 31 over the Bryansk region that borders Ukraine. Moscow mayor made no mention of the casualties or damage, but said the emergency services were examining the area where the drone fragments fell to the ground. The Federal Aviation Agency, Rosa Viazia, briefly ordered the suspension of operations at 2 airports near the capital, but the services were later resumed. Heavy rains pounded South Korea for the 3rd day in a deluge that has killed at least 4 people, forced thousands of people to evacuate their homes, and destroyed property and infrastructure. Warnings of the torrential rain remained in effect for most of the country's western and southern regions, and the Weather Service advised extreme caution with the landslides and the flooding possible through Saturday. 4 people have died in the rains, and 2 were missing. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said that he would not take orders from tariffs of a foreigner, referring to the U.S. President Donald Trump, and later called the United States threatened duty unacceptable blackmail. The comments made during 2 separate events mark the continuation of a spat between the 2 leaders that escalated when the U.S. announced a 50% tariff on Brazil last week. Lula and members of his cabinet have rejected the reasoning behind the tariffs and insisted on Brazil's sovereignty while calling for trade negotiations with the United States. Chinese Commerce Minister said that China has a plentiful toolbox to avoid an economic slump in the second half of the year. Growth hit 5.2% in the second quarter, but the analysts have warned that more must be done to boost the sluggish domestic consumption as the exports face the effects of the global trade turmoil. Retail sales rose far less than expected last month and were much weaker than May, suggesting efforts to kickstart consumption have fallen flat. Beijing is battling to shift towards a growth model propelled more by the domestic demand than the traditional key drivers of the infrastructure investment, manufacturing, and exports. Oil prices also gained as the investors weighed new European Union sanctions against Russia. The sanctions include measures aimed at dealing further blows to the Russian oil and energy industries. U.S. crude rose 1% to $68.19 per barrel, and Brent was up 0.8% to $70.06 a barrel. And this brings us to the end of the news bulletin for today. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.